This video serves as an introductory discussion on comparative mythology and folklore. Nature and definition. What is a myth? Myth is a symbolic narrative, usually of unknown origin and at least partially traditional, that ostensibly relates actual events and that is specially associated with religious beliefs. It is distinguished from symbolic behavior, or cult or ritual, and symbolic places or objects, like temples or icons. Myths are specific accounts of gods or superhuman beings involved in extraordinary events or circumstances in a time that is unspecified but which is understood as an existing apart from ordinary human experience. This definition is one of the many which can be considered too broad. Many specialists in the field of mythology, however, are not satisfied with such broad interpretations of the term myth. They attempt to distinguish true myth or myth proper from other varieties and seek to draw distinctions in terminology between myth and other words often used synonymously, such as legend, saga, and folktale. Morford and Leonardo in 2003 say that the impossibility of establishing a satisfactory definition of myth has not deterred scholars from developing comprehensive theories on the meaning and interpretation of myth, often to provide basis for a hypothesis about its origins. One thing is certain, no single theory of myth can cover all kinds of myths. The variety of traditional tales is matched by the variety of their origins and significance. As a result, no monolithic theory can succeed in achieving universal applicability. Definition of myth will tend to be either too limiting or too broad as to be virtually useless. The word myth is derived from the Greek mythos, which is a range of meanings from word through saying and story to fiction. The unquestioned validity of mythos can be contrasted with logos, the word whose validity or truth can be argued and demonstrated. Because myths narrate fantastic events with no attempt at proof, it is sometimes assumed that they are simply stories with no factual basis, and the word has become a synonym for falsehood or best misconception. Myth and other narrative forms. Relationship of myth to other narrative forms. Myth is a comprehensive but not exclusive term for stories primarily concerned with the gods and humankind's relations with them. In Western culture, there are a number of literary or narrative genres that scholars have related in different ways to myths. Examples are fables, fairy tales, folk tales, sagas, epics, legends, and theologic tales. Another form of tale, the parable, differs from myth in its purpose and character. Even in the West, however, there is no agreed definition of any of these genres, and some scholars question whether multiplying categories of narrative is helpful at all, as opposed to working with a very general concept such as the traditional tale. Non-Western cultures apply classifications that are different from both the Western categories and from one another. Here are some definitions of other narrative forms relative to myth. Folklore, in modern usage, is an academic discipline, the subject matter of which, also called folklore, comprises the sum total of traditionally derived and orally or imitatively transmitted literature, material culture, and custom of subcultures within predominantly literate and technologically advanced societies. In popular usage, the term folklore is sometimes restricted to the oral literature tradition. A legend is a story from the past about a subject that was or is believed to have been historical. Legends concerns people, places, and events. Usually, the subject is a saint, a king, a hero, a famous person, or a war. A legend is always associated with a particular place and a particular time in history. A folk tale is a story that in its plot is pure fiction and that has no particular location in either time or space. However, despite its elements of fantasy, a folktale is actually a symbolic way of presenting the different means by which human beings cope with the world in which they live. Folktales concern people, either royalty or common folk, or animals who speak and act like people. Functions of myth and mythology. The most obvious function of myth is the explanation of facts, whether natural or cultural. Myth has been used to find explanation on people's questions, but its narrative form distinguishes it from a straightforward answer to an intellectual question about causes. The function of explanation and the narrative form go together, since the imaginative power of the myth lends credibility to the explanation and crystallizes it into a memorable and enduring form. Hence, myths play an important part in many traditional systems of education. Many myths explain ritual and cultic customs. Myths are told in a number of societies where the main means of food production is the cultivation of fruit crops. The myths reflect the fact that tubers must be cut up and buried in the earth for propagation to take place. With a certain circularity frequent in mythology, the myth validates the very cultic celebration mentioned in the myth. The cult can be understood as a commemoration of those first events. Hence, the myth can be said to validate life itself together with the cultic celebration. Inasmuch as myths deal with the origin of the world, the end of the world, or the paradisiacal state, they are capable of describing what people can never see for themselves, however rational and observant they are. It may be that the educational value of myths is even more bound up with the descriptions they provide than with the explanations. In traditional pre-industrial societies, myths form perhaps the most important available model of instruction, since no separate philosophical system of inquiry exists. Creation myths play a significant role in healing the sick. They are recited, example among the Navajo people of North America, when an individual's world, that is to say, the person's life, is in jeopardy. Thus, healing through recitation of a cosmogony is one example of the use of myth as a magical incantation. Comparative mythology. The anthropologist C. Scott Littleton defined comparative mythology as a systematic comparison of myths and mythic themes drawn from a wide variety of cultures. By comparing different cultures' mythologies, scholars try to identify underlying similarities and or to reconstruct a proto-mythology from which those mythologies develop. To an extent, all theories about the mythology follow a comparative approach. As the scholar of religion Robert Segal notes, by definition, all theories of myth seek similarities among myths. Comparative mythology has served a variety of academic purposes. For example, scholars have used the relationships between different myths to trace the development of religions and cultures, to propose common origins for myths from different cultures, and to support various psychological theories. Scholars of mythology can be roughly divided into particularists, who emphasize the differences between myths, and comparativists, who emphasize the similarities. Particularists tend to maintain that the similarities deciphered by comparativists are vague and superficial, while comparativists tend to contend that the differences etched by particularists are trivial and incidental. An early approach to comparative mythology related to the notion of myths explaining natural phenomena was that of Friedrich Max Müller. Müller, 1866, viewed mythology as a disease of language. He believed most Indian, Greek, and Roman deities were originally just poetical names for forces of nature, which over time began to assume divine personalities never even contemplated by their creators. Müller identifies similarities between the linguistic name of father god figures from a variety of cultures. The relationship between myth and language are studied in far more detail in the structuralist approach to mythology. Levi Strauss, 1955, remarks that myth has many similarities to language in that it is, in essence, a language functioning on a specially high level. The structuralist approach addresses all the constituents of a myth. The myth is broken down into mythemes, which are the smallest component or units of a myth. Meaning is derived from the relations between pairs of mythemes, often opposites of one another. Example, light versus dark, life versus death, and others. An entirely different method is the psychological approach inspired by the works of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. Joseph Campbell, for example, was strongly influenced by the ideas from psychology. The psychological approach argues that the common motifs and themes that appear in many myths are due to universal subconscious archetypes in every person's mind. The idea of the monomyth is almost an extension of this. The monomyth explains the journey of the hero in many myths, often which reflect common human struggles and concerns. Other comparative approaches. Lyle 2012 looks for similar structures and roles for gods in many societies. Another approach is that of Witzel 2012. This method identifies common features from a variety of world mythologies that reflect the myth of our earliest ancestors from Africa. Many approaches to comparative mythology aim to find an myth, the idea that all myth evolved from an original single myth. A recent approach to the study of mythology is a phylogenetical analysis of myths. Phylogenetics is the study of evolutionary relationships among organisms based on parallelism of genes. De Huy 2013 observes that there are many similarities between biological and mythological evolution. In mythology, instead of genes, myths are transmitted. Then evolutionary relatedness between myths can be observed, and inferences about human migration and cultural diffusion can be made. A similar approach has been applied to analyze cross-cultural relationships among folktales. That ends this video on the introduction on comparative mythology and folklore. Please do not forget to like and subscribe on this channel.